You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
Welcome back to the Occult Rejects. This episode is about the prophet history tried to bury. There are names history preserves in gold, and names it leaves under ash. Mani is one of the buried ones. For centuries, much of the Western world did not really know Mani through his own voice, his own followers, or even his own books. It knew him through enemies, through polemic, through church fathers who remembered him as a rival, a corrupter, a heretic, a dangerous architect of false light. His name survived, but mostly an accusation. What was preserved was not the full shape of the man, but the silhouette of a threat. Modern scholarship has changed that picture, though. Through the discovery and study of Manichean manuscripts, above all the Cologne Mani Codex, and other materials from Egypt and Central Asia, scholars have been able to reconstruct a far richer and more historically grounded image of Mani and the movement he founded. And what emerges from that reconstruction is not a minor eccentric standing at the edge of late antiquity, but one of its boldest religious founders. Mani was not merely a teacher with a private mystical vision. He was a prophet, organizer, author, missionary strategist, and the founder of a religion that would stretch far beyond the lands of his birth. His community would eventually move across Iran, into the Roman world, through Central Asia, and as far as China. That scale matters because it forces us to see him not as a footnote to Christian heresiology, but as a man who understood himself to be speaking to the world. So this episode begins in a place where history often begins to darken, with recovery, with the effort to pull a voice back out of distortion, because Mani is one of those figures whose memory was fought over almost from the moment he lived. Even his biography became contested ground. He was a false apostle, a visionary, a radical dualist, a universal prophet, the heir to older revelations, or the founder of something entirely new. The answer, in many ways, is that he was dangerous, precisely because he tried to be more than one thing at once. He stood at the meeting point of religions, languages, empires, and cosmic claims, and he refused to stay small enough for any one tradition to contain him. Before he became a condemned man in theological memory, and before he became the shadow cast by the word Manichean, and before emperors, bishops, and rival priests turned him into a warning, Mani was a child born into a world already full of sects, visions, arguments, washings, scriptures, and competing maps of the unseen. And if we want to understand the prophet he became, we have to begin there, not at the moment of condemnation, but at the edge of the rivers, in the religious frontier that formed him. Mani was born in 216 CE in southern Mesopotamia, in the world of Sasanian Babylonia, a region that was not quiet, not isolated, and certainly not religiously simple. This was a land of crossings. Persian imperial authority stood over ancient Mesopotamian soil. Trade routes carried people and ideas. Jewish communities, Christian groups, Baptist sectarians, Iranian religious traditions, and other currents moved through the same broad landscape. Late antiquity here was not a sealed box of neat belief systems. It was a pressure zone, a place where cosmologies collided, where revelation was still a live possibility, and where new prophets could emerge because old certainties were already under strain. That matters, because Mani did not appear out of a vacuum. He was born into a world already arguing about purity, matter, salvation, prophecy, and the fate of the soul. His religion would later present itself as universal, as a truth not limited to one people or a kingdom, and that the universal ambition makes much more sense when you see the world he inherited. He grew up in a region where traditions overlapped and where no single religious language had total control over the spiritual imagination. In that sense, the world that made Mani was already preparing the ground for someone who would claim to gather earlier revelations into one final, total vision. But the setting was not only religiously rich, it was politically sharp. Mani's lifetime unfolded under the Sasanian Empire, a state powerful enough to shape the fate of religions and close enough to priestly authority that spiritual innovation always carried political risk. This is one of the things that gives Mani's story its tension from the beginning. Revelation in late antiquity was never just personal. It could become communal, public, institutional, and eventually imperial. To speak about the structure of the cosmos was also, in time, to risk speaking into the earshot of kings. And yet, the first world Mani knew was not the royal court. It was narrower, stricter, and more intimate than that. Before he preached across regions, before he wrote scriptures, before he painted doctrine and stood before power, he was formed inside a disciplined Baptist religious community. That is where the next part of the story begins. Not with empire, but with washing, hierarchy, purity, and the first sacred order he would one day leave behind. The first sacred order Mani knew was not imperial, not philosophical, and not yet universal. It was narrow, disciplined, ritualized, and severe. Modern scholarship, especially after the recovery of the Cologne Mani Codex, places Mani's youth inside a sectarian Jewish Christian Baptist community in southern Mesopotamia, usually linked with the Elkisate world. That point matters because it corrects a lot of older confusion. Mani was not originally raised in some vague Eastern mystery cult, nor was the evidence strongest for a Mandean upbringing. The best evidence points instead to a Christian-oriented Baptist milieu in which rites, washings, purity, and inherited revelation were taken with total seriousness. In that world, religion was not an abstract system of beliefs. It was practice. It was bodily. It was communal. It was something done through water, food, hierarchy, prohibition, and submission to sacred authority. The sources indicate that Mani was introduced into this community in his 4th year of life, meaning that the structure of sectarian religion was not something he encountered later as an outsider or critic. It formed him early. Its language of purity, its reverence for revealed truth, and its ritual seriousness all entered him before he even began to speak in his own name. This is one of the most important things to understand about Mani. He did not begin as a destroyer of religion. He began as a child inside religion, shaped by a community that already believed the world was spiritually dangerous and that human beings needed purification, discipline, and divine guidance. That later prophet of light and darkness first learned sacred order from people who believed salvation had to be enacted, not merely discussed. In that sense, Mani's later movement did not emerge from nowhere. It grew out of a house of washing, rules, and waiting. And yet, even in his early world, the later pattern of Mani's life was already there in miniature. He belonged to the community, but never entirely. The sources recovered from Manichean tradition present his youth as marked by visions, interventions of heavenly powers, and a growing awareness that the truth held by the Baptists was incomplete. That tension is essential to the story. Mani was not simply a rebellious child chafing against discipline. He was remembered as someone who felt very early that the sacred order around him was real and still insufficient. So the boy who would one day preach to kings began not in a palace, but in a sect, not under a crown, but under ritual, not as a public founder, but as a child growing inside a community that taught him purity, obedience, and the possibility that heaven could still speak. And according to Mani's own remembered story, heaven did speak. Not from a distant sky alone, but through a presence that came as his companion, his counterpart, the being he would know as the twin. Every prophet has a moment when the visible world breaks open. For Mani, that opening did not come first as a public sermon or a thunderclap before crowds. It came as an encounter, intimate, destabilizing, and impossible to forget. The Manichean tradition says that Mani was guided and protected by heavenly powers from early life, above all by his twin spirit, his divine pair or heavenly counterpart, rendered in different languages as his twin, syzygos, or companion. This figure was not a poetic ornament in Mani's story. It stood at the center of how he understood his calling. The later tradition preserves a 2-stage pattern of revelation. One report says the twin first disclosed the secrets of divine gnosis to Mani after his 12th year. then returned after his 24th year to command him to teach the world. But the exact sequence is debated in scholarship, and the safest thing to go with is the Cologne Mani Codex, which most securely ties Mani's decisive public vocation to his 24th year or his 25th year of life, in connection with the rise of Shapur around April 240 CE. That caution is worth following, because Mani's biography became hagiographic very early, and modern scholars are careful about separating devotional patterning from what can be more firmly reconstructed. Still, whatever uncertainties remain in the chronology, the shape of the experience is clear. Mani's remembered calling was not merely intellectual. He did not simply study his way out of the Baptist community. He received, in Manichean memory, a disclosure from beyond it. The twin reveals hidden knowledge, explains Mani's mission, and ultimately commissions him to separate from the community in which he had grown up. This is one of the places where the whole later religion is already present in seed form. Revelation comes as knowledge, but also as rupture. To learn the truth is to become unable to remain where you were. That makes the twin one of the most haunting figures in Mani's story. He is guide, witness, revealer, and authorization all at once. He is also the sign that Mani did not see himself as a freelance religious innovator. He understood his teachings as commissioned. The truth he would later preach was not, in his own account, self-invented. It was entrusted, given, pressed into him by a companion from the world above, a being who disclosed both the structure of reality and the task Mani had to carry into history. And this is where the darkness enters the story more sharply. Because revelation is one thing when it remains inward. It is another when it begins to challenge the sacred world that raised you. The sources indicate that Mani hesitated before confronting the Baptists with what he had received. But once he did, conflict followed. He and his father were called before the community's authorities. He defended himself before a synod of presbyters, and when he would not yield, he suffered suppression, maltreatment, and expulsion. The revelation of the twin did not free him into peace. It pushed him into history, and history answered with force. So the twin does not merely belong to Mani's mystical life. The twin is the turning point that transformed a gifted child of a Baptist sect into a founder. The companion from heaven becomes the voice that tears him out of one sacred order and sends him toward another. And once that command is given, the story can no longer remain hidden in a small community by the rivers of Mesopotamia. It begins moving outward, toward cities, courts, disciples, scripture, and the building of a religion that will try to outlive the corruption of time itself. There comes a point in the lives of certain visionaries when private revelation can no longer remain private. For Mani, that moment was not gentle. The world that had formed him became the world he could no longer inhabit. According to the Cologne Mani Codex, as summarized by Encyclopaedia Iranica, Mani had been hesitant to confront the Baptists directly, but once he began refuting their errors, the conflict sharpened. He and his father were called to account, and Mani had to defend himself before a synod of presbyters. But when he refused to yield, the result was maltreatment and, in effect, expulsion from the community which he had grown up. This is one of the great turning points in the story, because it is the moment when Mani stops being merely a gifted insider with unusual visions and becomes something more dangerous, a man with a revival claim to truth. The break matters not just emotionally, but structurally. Up to this point, Mani's revelations could still be imagined as the interior crisis of a sectarian religious life. After this, they became the seed of a new religious body. Iranica is explicit that Mani accepted his expulsion as a chance for a new start and understood himself to have been commissioned by his twin spirit to part from the paternal community altogether. He did something far more consequential. He began to gather people. Iranica notes that he set out with 2 disciples, later joined by his father, and appeared in Ctesiphon, where he began preaching his gospel publicly. That detail is crucial for this episode. This is not the story of a seer withdrawing from society. It is the story of a founder moving towards cities, hearers, and organized proclamation. The timing of that public beginning also carried symbolic force. The same source places Mani's first public proclamation when he was about 24 years old, nearly coinciding with the coronation of Shapur. Mani himself seems to have highlighted that synchronism, binding the start of his mission to the opening of a new political era. Even here, at the very threshold of the church, You can already feel the scale of his ambition. He was not presenting himself as the reformer of one Baptist sect. He was stepping into history as a herald for a new age. This is also where the tone of the biography changes. Before the rupture, Mani's life feels hidden, enclosed, almost monastic in its tension. After the rupture, it becomes public, mobile, and increasingly imperial in horizon. Cambridge's summary of Mani's career describes him as a preacher, healer, and wise man who debated with leading sages, gained followers from varied communities, traveled widely in Iran and Mesopotamia, and even beyond to India, and sought access to kings and aristocrats at the Sasanian courts. In other words, the church is born not as a local protest movement, but as the beginning of a mission. This is why this part matters so much. Expulsion did not reduce Mani. It clarified him. The old community cast him out, but in doing so, it forced the question that would define the rest of his life. Was he merely a dissenter from a Baptist sect or the founder of a religion meant for the world? Everything that follows, the scriptures, the art, the mission, the courtly encounters, the martyrdom, the spread across Eurasia, begins here, in the moment when exclusion becomes inauguration. And that is the darker irony at the center of Mani's story. The community that tried to silence him may also have helped create the conditions for his greatness. By closing one sacred house against him, it drove him toward the building of another, a church of light that would try to outlive memory, survive corruption, and speak in every land it could reach. If Mani's break with the Baptists explains how he became a founder, his cosmology explains why he believed founding a new religion was necessary at all. The center of Manichean teaching is not just a moral contrast between good and evil, but a full-scale cosmogonic drama built around two primordial realms, the world of light and the world of darkness. In the standard scholarly reconstruction, these are not temporary conditions inside one created universe. They are primal, opposing realities, and Mani's myth is meant to explain the origin of evil, the damaged condition of the world, and the human's role inside that damage. That distinction matters because Mani's universe is darker and stranger than a simple good versus bad morality tale. The world of light is harmonious, blessed and self-sufficient, but in its peace it is initially unprepared for assault. The world of darkness, by contrast, is a realm of chaos, aggression, greed, strife, and destructive desire. In the Manichean account summarized by Encyclopaedia Iranica, the crisis begins when the powers of darkness perceive the realm of light and surge upward against it. Evil here is not merely absence or ignorance. It is an invasive force. It wants to seize, consume, and mix itself with what does not belong to it. And this is where the myth becomes unforgettable. The attack of darkness is not met first by brute domination, but by a kind of divine self-sacrifice. The Father of Greatness sends forth the first man, who descends into battle clothed in his armor of the 5 light elements. He is overwhelmed, and those luminous elements are partly devoured by the demonic powers. Yet, what looks like catastrophe becomes the beginning of rescue, because the swallowed light weakens the enemy from within. Iranica describes this logic as a victory achieved through self-sacrifice. The saving drama begins not with untouched triumph, but with light entering captivity in order to break captivity open from the inside. From there, the visible cosmos takes on its shocking meaning. The world is not in Manichean thought a neutral setting or a simple creation to be celebrated without remainder. It is built as both a mechanism of rescue and a prison, a structure formed out of subdued demonic powers so that the still trapped particles of light can be gradually purified, sorted, and released. That is why the myth feels so eerie. The world is both battlefield and machine, both wound and remedy. It exists because light and darkness became entangled, and history becomes the long labor of separating what should never have been mixed. The myth grows darker still when it reaches humanity. In Manichean tradition, Adam and Eve are not simply the innocent first pair of straightforward biblical beginning. The powers of darkness fashion the human couple as a part of counter-creation, a more efficient prison for the scattered substance of light. The story of human generation is therefore bound up with demonic appetite, greed, and sexual desire. Iranica's entry on the Manichean Pantheon explicitly links the procreation of the first human couple with sinful sexual acts and with the larger logic of greed, lust, and the perpetuation of captivity. Human reproduction does not merely continue life. In Mani's dark reading of the cosmos, it also continues the imprisonment of light in matter. This is why Mani's religion puts such pressure on bodily life. If particles of light are scattered through the cosmos and caught inside living existence, then the human being is not simply a moral agent deciding whether to behave well. The human person is part of the cosmic crisis itself. Human life matters because it participates in the larger work of liberation. Knowledge, discipline, ritual practice, and bodily ordering all contribute to freeing the trapped light, what Manichean tradition speaks of as the suffering world soul. And by the same logic, sexuality, generation, appetite, and embodiment are never just private concerns. They are caught up in the great struggle between mixture and release. So when Mani speaks about salvation, he is not offering self-improvement. He is describing extraction, release, rescue from mixture. He is teaching that the world, beautiful as it may sometimes appear, is also a site of captivity, and that the human task is to help end the captivity rather than deepen it. Once the audience understands that Mani saw the cosmos itself as a damaged mingling of divine light and ravenous darkness, everything else begins to click into place. The asceticism, the food rules, the suspicion of generation, the scripture, the art, the rituals, the missionary urgency, and even the martyrdom. Mani was not founding a religion to improve the world. He was founding one to help free what the world had trapped inside itself. If Mani believed the cosmos itself had become a catastrophic mixture of light and darkness, then revelation too lived under threat. Truth could be lost. Teaching could be bent. Memory could decay. This is one of the most important things modern scholarship has clarified about Mani. He did not only proclaim a message, he tried to build a form strong enough to preserve it. Cambridge's The Scriptures of Mani puts the point plainly. One of the defining features of Manichaeism was that Mani himself wrote down the revealed teachings, and he presented this as a major advantage of his church because it meant the doctrine would endure and not be led astray. In contrast, earlier apostles had left their words to be remembered and recorded by disciples, opening the way to distortion and corruption. That gives this part of the story its force. Mani was not just a mystic receiving visions. He was a strategist of preservation. He believed previous revelations had been true, but that their communities had not always guarded them faithfully. So his answer was not to reject the train of earlier messengers, but to outmaneuver historical decay. He would write, he would organize, he would give his movement a fixed body of teaching that could travel, be copied, and remain anchored to the apostles' own authority. That is one reason scholars sometimes describe Manichaeism as unusually deliberate in its construction. Scripture, ritual, mission, and organization were not afterthoughts but part of the design from the start. This is where Mani begins to look less like a wandering religious genius and more like the architect of a durable system. The canonical Manichaean corpus was remembered as a set of 7 major works, and among them the Living Gospel or Great Gospel held pride of place. The Encyclopaedia Iranica entry of Angelin says the Gospel was regarded as the most important of Mani's 7 canonical books and was treated in some traditions as the king of the writings. It was divided into 22 chapters, corresponding to 22 letters of the Syriac alphabet, which gives it an added sense of deliberate sacred form. And there is another detail that matters in this story. Almost all of Mani's works were written in his Eastern Aramaic mother tongue, with the major exception of Sebu Regan, which was composed in Middle Persian. That tells us something important about Mani's project. He was not writing for one narrow sect alone. He was already thinking about audience, translation, power, and transmission. He was shaping revelation so it could move between worlds. This also sharpens the emotional logic of the story. Mani had already been forced out of one sacred community. He had already seen what happens when truth is contested inside institutions. So when he built his own church, he did not trust charisma alone. He did not trust memory alone. He did not trust discipleship without written form. He wanted a religion that could survive distance, persecution, and time itself. He wrote because he knew how easily a message could be broken once it left the mouth of the prophet. And yet even that was not enough, because Mani seems to have understood something else. Words can preserve doctrine, but images can seize the mind. The next step in the story is where the prophet becomes something stranger still. Not only author, not only apostle, but painter. Not just a man of books, but a man who tried to make revelation visible. That is where the episode turns next, to one of the most haunting features of Mani's legacy, the Ars Hang, the Book of Pictures. If Mani wrote because truth could be corrupted in memory, he turned to images because truth also needed to be seized by the eye. One of the most distinctive features of his legacy is the Ars Hang, remembered in scholarship as Mani's Book of Pictures, an extra-canonical work made up of drawings and paintings meant to illustrate the central features of Manichean dualist doctrine. Encyclopaedia Iranica describes it as a visual teaching work, probably connected to the living gospel but distinct from it, and the companion entry on Manichean art notes that Mani's picture, likely first conceived as a painting scroll, shaped later Manichean pictorial traditions across regions and centuries. This matters because it makes Mani something stranger and more formidable than a prophet of words alone. He appears in the academic record as a founder who understood that scripture and image could work together as a single strategy of preservation. Text could anchor doctrine. Images could drive it into memory. If the world was a battlefield of confusion, mixture, and deception, then sacred art was not decoration. It was instruction. It was doctoral technology. It was a way of making cosmology portable, vivid, and hard to forget. And there is a darker implication here that fits the whole shape of Mani's project. He had already seen what could happen when revelation passed through communities, rivals, and time. Words alone might be argued over, fractured, or rewritten. But painted scenes of light, darkness, cosmic struggle, and deliverance could strike the mind in another register altogether. The religion was being designed not only to be believed, but to be seen. That helps explain why later Manichean book culture preserves such a strong appreciation for visual form. The founder himself made vision part of transmission. So by this point in the story, Mani is no longer just a child of a Baptist sect, or even only a revealer with a heavenly twin. He is becoming the architect of a religious machine built to outlast distortion. He has revelation. He has scripture. Now he has image. And once a founder has all three, the next question is inevitable. Can such a religion remain small, hidden, and sectarian? Or does it begin pressing toward kings? The next stage of Mani's life does not unfold in retreat, but in proximity to power. Modern scholarship presents him not as an isolated mystic, but as a preacher, healer, and wise man who traveled widely, debated rival sages, gathered adherents from different religious communities, and sought access to the courts of the Sasanian Empire. That shift is decisive. The prophet who had been forced out of one sacred community now stepped into a larger arena, where the stakes were no longer only sectarian, but imperial. The Manichean tradition and later scholarly reconstruction tie the beginning of Mani's public mission closely to the opening of Shapur's reign. And Encyclopaedia Iranica notes that the start of Manichean missionary activity was remembered as nearly coincident with Shapur's coronation. The synchronism matters because it shows how Mani framed his vocation, not as a private revelation buried in a corner of Mesopotamia, but as a message emerging at the start of a new political age. He was aligning prophecy with history. The strongest symbol of that alignment is the Sabuwragan, the major work associated with Mani's presentation of his teaching to Shapur. Scholarship consistently treats it as the key exception among Mani's writings because, unlike most of his canonical works, it was composed in Middle Persian rather than his Eastern Aramaic mother tongue. That detail is more than linguistic trivia. It reveals adaptation, audience awareness, and ambition. Mani was shaping revelation so it could speak not only within the language of his own community, but within the political and cultural world of empire. And yet, this should not be told as though Shapur simply converted and the story became easy. The academic picture is more careful than that. Mani appears to have gained court access, prestige, and room to preach, but the deeper point is not a neat royal conversion narrative. It is he intentionally pursued rulers and aristocrats because his mission was universal in scale. Encyclopaedia Iranica goes so far as to say that few religions undertook world mission in a more systematic way than the Manichean Church. So the court is not a detour in the story. It is one of the clearest signs that Mani was trying to build a religion fit for the world he lived in, multilingual, mobile, and bold enough to stand in the shadow of kings. This gives the story a new tension. Once revelation enters the court, it becomes exposed to a different kind of danger. Patronage can open doors, but it also places prophecy near rival priests, state interests, suspicion, and future reversal. Mani's movement gained breadth in this world, but it also moved closer to the forces that would later help crush its founder. That is the dark magnificence of this phase. Mani did not dream of a hidden truth for a few initiates. He wanted a public religion, a world religion. He was willing to test it in the most dangerous places possible, before the empire itself. Mani is no longer acting like the leader of a breakaway sect. He is speaking on a far larger scale. Modern scholarship is clear that Mani presented his message as universal, not a local correction for one community, but a revelation meant to gather, complete, and surpass earlier religious traditions. In Manichean memory, he named Buddha, Zarathustra, and Jesus as his forerunners, and later Manichean tradition could even describe him as the final or sealing prophet in that line. At the same time, scholars stress that Christianity, Gnosticism, and Zoroastrian currents seem to have played a stronger role in the earliest formation of his religion than Buddhism did, even if Buddhism became important for Manichaeism's later self-understanding and expansion. That is what gives Mani's claim its strange force. He does not preach as though revelation began with him. He preaches as though earlier revelations were partial, regional, or vulnerable to corruption, and that his own mission is to restore them inside a single, final framework. Cambridge scholarship notes that Mani habitually styled himself the Apostle of Jesus Christ, and other sources show that Manichaeans could identify him with the Paraclete foretold in the Gospel of John. But this was not Orthodox Christian language in an Orthodox Christian sense. It was the rhetoric of a new religion claiming that the truth announced before had now arrived in fuller form through Mani himself. And this is where the episode gets interesting again. Because a prophet who claims to stand in continuity with Jesus is already controversial. A prophet who claims to complete Jesus while also placing Buddha and Zarathustra inside the same sacred chain becomes something far more dangerous. He is no longer asking for tolerance. He is redrawing sacred history. He is saying that the religions of the world were not separate accidents, but fragments of one unfolding disclosure, and that he is the figure in whom those fragments are meant to be understood together. That is one reason modern scholars keep treating Manichaeism as a religion in its own right rather than simply a Christian heresy. Mani was not borrowing authority at the edges of older traditions. He was reorganizing them around himself. So this is when Mani's ambition becomes unmistakable. He is not merely founding a church. He is offering a map of world religion with himself at the interpretive center. Earlier messengers spoke to particular peoples in particular lands at particular moments. Mani's revelation, by contrast, is presented as portable, multilingual, and fitted for all nations. That universalism is not a side note in Manichaeism. It is one of its core engines, and it helps explain why the religion moves so effectively across cultures after Mani's death. And once a prophet begins to speak that way, the next question becomes unavoidable. What kind of human structure can carry a cosmic message to the world? Revelation alone is not enough. There must be discipline, rank, obligation, and a way for ordinary believers and spiritual elites to live inside the same redemptive machine. That is where the story turns next, toward the elect and the hearers, and the daily architecture of Mani's church. If Mani was going to preach a universal religion, he needed more than revelation. He needed a human structure strong enough to carry it, and the structure he built was not flat. It was tiered, disciplined, and charged with cosmic purpose. The scholarly picture is clear that Manichean life was organized around two-tiered community of the elect and the hearers. This was not just a practical division between clergy and laity. It was a division of labor inside the work of salvation itself. Manichaeism taught that the faithful had to remodel their entire lives around two linked aims: the salvation of the imprisoned light and the survival of the Manichean community that carried out that work. That arrangement only makes full sense once you remembered Mani's cosmology. If particles of light are trapped throughout the material world, then bodily conduct is never merely personal morality. It becomes cosmic technique. Encyclopaedia Iranica explains that the strict rules of Manichean ethics follow directly from the cosmogony. Encyclopaedia Iranica explains that the strict rules of Manichean ethics follow directly from the cosmogony. Meat, wine, sexual activity, killing, injury to living things, and even certain ordinary forms of labor were bound up with harm to the vulnerable world soul still mixed into matter. These demands were so severe that the religion solved the problem by creating two levels of obligation: a small elite of perfect or elect believers, and a much larger body of devout lay supporters. The elect were the holy specialists of Mani's church. They lived under what the sources describe as 5 rigorous commandments, and their lives were narrowed almost completely to sacred work: hearing and reading scriptures, singing hymns, offering prayers, attending services, teaching and preaching, and above all, participating in the sacramental communal meal. They were forbidden to eat meat, drink alcohol, engage in sexual activity, or ordinarily earn their own livelihood. Within later scholarly description, their discipline is also often summarized through the 3 seals: the seal of the mouth, the hands, and the bosom, purity in what is consumed and said, harmlessness in action, and chastity in bodily life. The point was not self-denial for its own sake. The elect were being shaped into bodies fit for sacred labor. And nowhere is that more vivid than in the sacred meal. Iranica's pre-Islamic survey says the central Manichean practice was the meal held once a day for the elect, whose purpose was to free the trapped particles of life contained in carefully chosen food. The general survey describes the elect's digestive system as the instrument by which light imprisoned in fruits, vegetables, juices, and water could be released and sent upward again in hymns and prayers. Another Iranica entry puts it even more strikingly. The elect became the embodiment of a distilling machine, ritually prepared to separate light from matter within their own bodies, from where it could ascend by way of the moon and sun toward the paradise of light. That is one of the strangest and most revealing features of Mani's religion. Holiness was not just belief or moral example. It was metabolic redemption. The hearers, by contrast, lived under a less demanding rule, described in Iranica as 10 more moderate commandments. But they were not peripheral. They were the mainstay of the community. Since the elect could not prepare food themselves without risking harm to plants, water, or living substance, the hearers had to take on that burden for them. Their chief duty was almsgiving, but almsgiving in Manichaeism meant much more than generosity in the abstract. It meant feeding, clothing, housing, and in some cases protecting the elect. The lay believers sustained the holy body whose sacred meal and sacred discipline were believed to redeem the world. In that sense, even the lesser path of the hearers was fully plugged into Mani's cosmic economy of rescue. The church also had hierarchy within hierarchy. Iranica notes that the elect were ordered beneath a leader who presided over 12 teachers, 72 bishops, and 360 householders or priests. So Mani's religion was not a loose mystical current drifting from one ecstatic teacher to another. It was a church with ranks, offices, obligations, and channels of authority. That matters for the tone of this episode, because it shows again that Mani was building something meant to endure. Revelation alone was too fragile. It had to be lodged in living institutions. So the church of the elect and the hearers should be imagined less as a congregation and more as an organism. One body lives under extreme purity, prayer, and sacramental discipline. The other body feeds it, shelters it, and keeps it alive in the world. One liberates light through sacred conduct. The other makes liberation possible through support and service. Together they form a coordinated labor of bodies, rules, and dependence. And once a religion is built that way, it cannot remain abstract. It must develop rhythms of confession, fasting, gathering, and repair. That is where the story turns next, from structure into sacred time. A religion this exact could not live on doctrine alone. It needed repetition. It needed sacred time. It needed ways for imperfect people to return, confess, atone, and begin again. Manichean life was structured by reoccurring rites of fasting, confession, prayer, and communal gathering, not as ornament, but as maintenance for a church that knew the world was wounded and that human beings, even the devout, would fail inside it. Encyclopaedia Iranica notes that both elect and hearers underwent regularly repeated atonement ceremonies, with weekly observations and broader rites on major feast days. In other words, Mani's church was built with weakness in mind. It expected failure and ritualized the need for repair. Confession stood near the center of that repair. Iranica's entry on confessions says that Monday was the day of weekly confession for both hearers and elect, though only the elect could hear confession. There was a special liturgy for the day, including the singing of the so-called Monday hymns, one of the characteristic genres of Manichean religious poetry. Another Iranica entry on Manichean festivals reinforces the same rhythm. Monday was marked as the Day of the Gods, confession of sins associated especially with the elect, and linked with reading scripture, propagating wisdom, and mutual forgiveness. This means repentance in Mani's church was not only inward remorse, it was musical, communal, formalized, and built into the calendar. The weekly pattern was sharper than a vague cycle of meetings. Iranica's survey of pre-Islamic Manichaeism says the community gathered on Sunday and Mondays, with Sunday especially important for the hearers and Monday for the elect. That gives the church a distinct pulse, one day oriented more toward the lay body of believers, another toward the stricter inner life of the holy elite. Once you place confession, hymns, absolution, and instruction into that weekly rhythm, Manichaeism stops sounding like a floating cosmology and starts sounding like a lived religious discipline with fixed returns, recurring obligations, and sacred time pressing into ordinary life. Prayer also needs to be made visible here. Iranica's entry on the Manichean Pantheon says that the ordinary believer was instructed to direct prayer toward the sun and moon, the visible residences and symbols of divinity, especially of the third messenger in Jesus. The detail is one of the most revealing in the whole religion. It means that for Mani's followers, the sky was not mere backdrop. The heavens were part of devotion itself. The believer turned bodily toward the cosmic process of salvation, orienting prayer toward the great lights that served as vehicles and signs of liberation. And this devotion was not only mental. Scholarship on everyday Manichean life in Kellis emphasizes the role of embodied practices such as prayer, singing, and prostration in constructing Manichean group identity. That is an important corrective, because it reminds us that Mani's religion was not sustained by abstract belief alone. It was enacted through kneeling bodies, repeated gestures, chanted words, and disciplined posture. The Church of Light trained the body to belong to its vision of the cosmos. Fasting gave all of this an even deeper seriousness. The Bema and festival material shows that one of the central annual observances came at the end of a fasting month, but the weekly Monday rhythm also carried fasting duties, especially for the elect. So the calendar of Mani's church was not simply a schedule of commemorations. It was a regime of hunger, confession, hymns, prayer, and reoccurring purification. The faithful did not just believe that the world was a place of mixture. They were taught to feel the brokenness through the ritual deprivation and to answer it through repeated acts of repentance and sacred discipline. So by this point, the Manichean church should feel fully inhabited. It has structures, ranks, ethical seals, sacred meals, weekly confession, Sunday and Monday gatherings, prayers turned toward the sun and moon, bodily gestures of devotion, and fasting that gives sorrow and hope a reoccurring form. The religion of light is no longer just a doctrine about the universe. It has become a rhythm of life. And that is what makes the next part of this so powerful. Because the greatest festival of Mani's church was built not around his physical presence, but around his absence. An empty throne, an annual return, and a community refusing to let the dead prophet disappear. By the time we reach the Bema, Mani's religion no longer feels like a set of ideas. It feels inhabited. It has ranks, fasting, confession, hymns, obligations, and memory. And at the center of one of its greatest annual observances stands a haunting image, an empty, raised throne. The very word Bema means a platform or raised seat, and in Manichean ritual life, it became the name of the festival that marked the end of a fasting period and, in later tradition, commemorated Mani's death and spiritual ascension. In the Babylonian lunar calendar, it fell in late February or March, at the close of a fasting month. That image is powerful because it turns absence into presence. The prophet is not physically there, but the throne remains. Scholarship on the Bema describes ritual gatherings centered on Mani's empty throne, with confession and communal meal linked to the ceremony, while Encyclopaedia Iranica notes the prominence of Bema hymns across multiple Manichean language traditions. The festival was not simply a memorial in a weak sense. It was a staged return of Mani into the community's ritual imagination. The founder remembered, enthroned, mourned, and glorified at once. And that fits perfectly with the darker arc of Mani's life. He died under Bahram I, after trial, imprisonment, and the rise of hostile forces at court, and Manichean memory treated that death as a martyrdom, even a kind of crucifixion. The Bema gave the community a way to transform that defeat into liturgical triumph. Instead of allowing the founder's death to become silence, the festival turned it into a calendar, chant, and sacred space. The dead prophet was not erased by prison. He was raised into ritual memory. There is also something deeply revealing here about Mani's religion as a whole. It was built to survive loss. Mani wrote because teachings could be corrupted. He painted because truth needed to be seen. And after his death, his followers built a festival around an empty throne because memory itself needed form. The Bema shows a church refusing to let its founder dissolve into the past. It disciplines grief. It ritualizes longing. It teaches the community how to stand before absence and still believe that light is winning. The church fasts, the hymns rise, the throne stands ready. And over everything hangs the strange Manichean conviction that the prophet who is humiliated in history has already gone upward in glory. That is what makes the Bema more than a feast day. It is the ritual proof that Mani's followers believed imprisonment did not end his authority. It only changed the place from which he ruled. If the Bema gave Mani's followers a throne for absence, song gave them a way to carry presence. Manichaeism was not only a religion of books, paintings, fasting, and confession. It was also a religion of hymns, psalms, chanting, and performed memory. Scholarly work on the Turfan materials shows that Manichean hymnology in Middle Persian and Parthian was not casual or improvised. Manuscripts preserve features like a presentation of hymn texts, the use of initial letters, indications of melodies, and signs of cantillation. In other words, this was a community that did not just preserve doctrine and writing, it preserved the ways of sounding it. That matters because music changes the emotional temperature of a religion. A doctrine can be taught in prose, but it becomes communal in chant. It becomes memorial in refrain. It becomes bodily when it is breathed, repeated, and heard in assembly. Encyclopaedia Iranica notes that prayers, sermons, and above all hymns accompanied Manichean gatherings, and that the surviving literature preserves not just isolated pieces, but extensive hymn material, including long Parthian hymn cycles and innumerable individual hymns. The same reference work also emphasizes that Manichean hymns and psalms survive in large numbers in both the Coptic and Iranian traditions, which means this musical devotional life was not peripheral. It was one of the major ways the religion lived across languages and regions. And if this fits Mani himself, Iranica describes him not only as a founder and painter, but as an imaginative storyteller and even a composer of 2 cycles of psalms, adding that these achievements helped make Manichaeism a decidedly aesthetic religion. That phrase is especially useful for this show because it captures something deeper than ornament. Mani's religion was aesthetic in the strongest sense. It used image, story, lyric poetry, and chant to shape the soul against forgetfulness. The faith was not only argued, it was staged in sound. The dead prophet is remembered not only by calendar and ritual seat, but by voices rising through the room. Hymns making cosmology intimate. They turn light and darkness, exile and rescue, martyrdom and ascent into something people can carry in memory long after the sermon ends. And that may be one of the deepest reasons Mani's religion traveled so far. It knew how to become portable, not only in books, but in breath. If we want to know what Mani's religion looked like when it was no longer standing before kings or speaking in the voice of founders, we have to go somewhere smaller. We have to go into houses, letters, family networks, work routines, grief, gift-giving, and village life. That is why Kelis, the late antique settlement in Egypt's Dakhla oasis, matters so much. Modern scholarship treats Kelis as one of the richest windows into Manichaeism as a lived religion, not just a system of doctrine. The surviving letters and archaeological remains show that Manichaean identity in Kelis was woven into ordinary concerns like travel, business, kinship, writing, and local social obligations. And that changes the emotional texture of the whole thing. In the great cosmological texts, Manichaeism can sound like a total war between light and darkness. But the Kelis evidence shows that even a religion built on cosmic urgency had to live inside ordinary human time. Matthias Brand's work, as summarized in scholarly reviews, show that the letters from Kelis often speak in the language of family, village, and economic support as much as in distinctively Manichaean terms. Religious identity was real, but it was not the only thing these people were. They were parents, siblings, traders, travelers, scribes, mourners, and neighbors. Sometimes Manichaeanness was highly visible. Sometimes it sat in the background, latent until ritual or conflict called it forth. This is one of the most important corrections Kelis gives us. Older depictions often imagine Manichaeans as tightly sealed, persecuted sect living in constant fear. But Brand argues that the evidence from Kelis does not support that simple picture. The letters suggest a network of villages living in relative peace, interacting with local elites, handling disputes through ordinary channels, and even living alongside signs of Roman administration and military presence. In other words, the religion survived not only through heroic resistance, but through adaptation, domestic routine, and the slow durability of social ties. And there is something else profoundly fitting in that. Many had built a religion meant to outlast corruption and travel across lands. But in Kelis, we see what that really meant on the ground. Not only hymns and fasting, but houses full of texts, family archives, scribal labor, gifts, meals, and grief at the death of loved ones. The light was not being guarded only by prophets or elect in distant courts. It was being carried in homes. And once you see that, the religion becomes both stranger and more human. It is no longer just a grand cosmology descending from above. It is a faith learning how to breathe inside everyday life. If Kelis shows us that Manichaeism lived in houses and letters, then the next thing it reveals is just as important. The religion moved through relationships. It traveled through kinship, patronage, business ties, and habitual exchange. Recent scholarship on Kelis argues that the Manichaean community there was built on a network structure of itinerant elect and family units, rather than on isolation from village life, and that the local religious identity was entangled with family and social connections rather than sealed off from them. A recent review of Matthias Brand's work likewise emphasizes that in Kelis, family, village, and religious connections formed a single social web, not neatly separate spheres. That matters because it changes the cast of the story. Mani's religion was not carried only by male teachers preaching abstract dualism. The evidence from Kelis points to a prominent role for women within the community. A recent Cambridge study on women's social capital in late antique Egypt, drawing directly on the Kelis papyri, notes that Manichaean social structure was founded on reciprocal ties between the aesthetic elect and the catechumens who materially supported them, and that the documents show a surprising emphasis on the prominent role of women within the community. The same study highlights women such as Tahat, who appears as a business owner directing employees, managing textile production, recording wages and payments, and participating in charitable and religious giving. And that gives the religion a deeper human architecture. The same evidence suggests that women were not merely passive relatives of male believers, but active nodes in the circulation of goods, gifts, labor, and prestige. The Kelis material also preserves indications of women's literacy, book copying, travel, and extended family life, showing that the community's survival depended not only on formal doctrine, but on people who could write, remember, organize, send, receive, and sustain. In some letters, women appear as recognized patrons or honored members of the Holy Church. One text cited in the Cambridge study addresses Irene as daughter of the Holy Church and the catechumen of the faith, in language that fuses spiritual hierarchy with social standing. So at this point, Manichaeism should feel less like a distant cosmology and more like a living network. Light moved through doctrine, yes, but also through mothers, patrons, widows, artisans, correspondents, and households that knew how to keep a community alive. That may be one of the most important lessons Kellis offers. World religion survives not only because prophets speak, but because ordinary people carry one another. And in Mani's church, that carrying was often done through family obligation, almsgiving, literacy, and the quiet strength of women whose names still surface in the papyri. By this stage, Mani's religion is no longer a vision held together by one founder's charisma. It has become a system built to move. Scholarship is unusually direct on this one point. Encyclopaedia Iranica says that hardly any other religion pursued world mission in a more deliberate and systematic way than the Manichean Church. Mani's followers understood this expansion not as accidental growth, but as part of the religion's design from the beginning. The same scholarly tradition ties that missionary impulse back to Mani's calling itself, presenting the spread of faith as inseparable from the prophet's original commission. That is what makes Manichaeism feel so different from a merely local sect. It was built for translation, movement, and adaptation. Iranica notes that Mani intended his religion to be proclaimed in all tongues and in all lands, and his use of a fixed written canon helped make that possible. Cambridge scholarship on Mani's public career reinforces this same picture. After his break with the Baptist community, he traveled widely within Iran and Mesopotamia and even beyond India while seeking converts among kings, aristocrats, and varied religious communities. This was not a hidden esoteric circle trying to remain pure by staying small. It was a portable religion trying to enter history at a scale. And once it began moving, it kept moving. Modern scholarship increasingly treats Manichaeism as a religion of the Silk Roads as much as a problem in early Christian heresiology. Cambridge's work on Mani and later studies of Christians and Manichaeans on the Silk Road show the religion's manuscript and material presence stretching deep into Central Asia and China, where discoveries at sites such as Kwoko and Duong confirmed just how far Mani's church had traveled. What began in Mesopotamia did not stay there. It crossed deserts, languages, and empires. The same religion that had once lived in a Baptist community by the rivers of Mesopotamia was now moving through merchant routes, royal courts, village houses, hymn books, painted texts, and multilingual scriptural traditions. Mani had wanted a revelation that could survive corruption and distance. Mission was the proof that his followers believed it could. But every expansion carries its own danger, because the farther a religion spreads, the more it must reckon with the human body itself, with hunger, illness, purity, discipline, and the fact that cosmic war is fought not only across empires, but inside flesh. As Mani's religion spread across lands and languages, its war remained intimate. The great struggle between light and darkness was not only written in the sky or in mythic time, it was written in the body. Modern scholarship on late antique Manichaeism stresses that health, illness, purity, and bodily discipline were not marginal issues in the religion. They were bound up with the salvation itself. Nicholas Baker O'Brien's study in Harvard Theological Review shows that Manichaean thought could valorize both health and illness in complex ways, because the body was understood as a site where cosmic forces were entangled and where spiritual labor had to be enacted. This fits the larger cosmology exactly. Encyclopaedia Iranica notes that Manichaeism promised redemption of the human soul from its bodily bonds in the transcendent world of light, while its cosmogony describes humanity as a microcosm, reflecting the larger cosmos. In that scheme, the human body is not merely personal flesh. It is a reduced image of the world itself, a smaller theater in which the same mixed conditions of light and darkness is being lived out. The body matters because it mirrors the broken universe. This is why bodily discipline becomes so charged. The strict practices of the elect, food rules, aesthetic restraint, ritual prayer, fasting, and carefully structured conduct were not just ethical exercises. They were techniques of separation. If particles of light were trapped in the material order, then the holy body had to become an instrument for loosening that captivity. Even suffering could be interpreted through this lens, not simply a misfortune, but as evidence that life in matter was a contested condition. Brian Baker argues that Manichean sources did not treat illness in a flat way. Rather, they embedded bodily affliction with a larger spiritual anthropology, in which the faithful body is both vulnerable and meaningful. The religion that had crossed empires now closes in on the human frame. The battlefield is no longer only out in the world. It is under the skin. Hunger, weakness, sexuality, purity, digestion, pain, all of it becomes legible inside Mani's vision as part of the long struggle to free what is luminous from what has imprisoned it. And once a religion reaches that level, conflict with political and priestly power becomes almost inevitable, because a faith that claims the body, the cosmos, and the fate of the soul at once is no longer merely one cult among others. It is a total rival vision of reality. That is where the story turns next, toward imprisonment, death, and the making of Mani as a martyr. In the end, the universal prophet did not die in triumph before kings. He died in custody. Modern scholarship reconstructs Mani's last years against the changing politics of the Sasanian court, where the growing power of the Mazda-Yazdian priesthood and the accession of Bahram created a far more hostile climate for him than the one he had known under Shapur. Cambridge's study of Mani's death says his priestly ascendancy led ultimately to his trial, imprisonment, and death at Gandhashapur under Bahram. The details of the final crisis were remembered in different ways, and scholars are careful here, because later Manichean tradition shaped the episode into sacred drama. Even so, the broad outline is stable. Mani was summoned, accused, imprisoned, and chained, and his death followed in confinement. Older reports preserved and later sources even suggest that one pretext against him involved the alleged failure of his healing activity in connection with a royal relative, which fits the larger picture of a prophet whose public stature had become politically dangerous. What matters most here is not only that Mani died, but how his followers understood the death. Cambridge's reconstruction notes that the Manichean community commemorated it as his crucifixion and compared his suffering to that of earlier righteous messengers. The front matter to the Founder of Manichaeism adds that the Manichean tradition explicitly drew parallels between Mani's death and the death of Jesus, with Bahram cast in roles analogous to Pilate or Herod and Mani's end framed as martyrdom, followed by exaltation. In other words, history gave them a prison death. Liturgy transformed it into a passion. There is even uncertainty in the exact dating, which tells you how early memory and history began to overlap. Encyclopaedia Iranica notes that early sources support 274 CE for Mani's death, while some other traditions yielded neighboring dates. What remained constant was the community's conviction that his death marked not only an ending, but an ascension, so much so that a Manichean era could later be counted from the year of his death. The founder, who had tried to protect revelation from corruption, now became, in death, the central martyr of the church's sacred memory. Mani, who had written to outlast distortion, painted to outlast forgetfulness, and preached before the empire itself, ended in chains. But in the memory of his followers, prison does not cancel the prophet. It seals him. His humiliation becomes authority. His suffering becomes a calendar. His death becomes one of the chief reasons the religion could endure after him at all. What makes Mani so difficult to bury is that his death did not stop the religion. It exposed how well he had built it to travel. Modern scholarship treats Manichaeism not as a local cult that briefly flared around one charismatic founder, but as a religion that spread astonishingly far, from the Roman world across Iran and Central Asia and into China, where its textual and ritual life took on new forms without losing its core identity as the religion of light. Cambridge's Founder of Manichaeism summarizes the scale starkly. The community Mani founded spread from North Africa to South China and endured far more than 1,000 years. This expansion was not accidental. Iranica stresses that Mani aimed to secure his religion by proclaiming it in all tongues and in all lands, using a fixed written canon to make the faith portable across languages and frontiers. That ambition helps explain why Manichaeism appears so naturally in Silk Road contexts. It was built for movement, translation, and adaptation. By the time scholars trace it through Central Asia, it is already visible in a multilingual manuscript world that includes Middle Iranian, Turkic, and Chinese materials. The route eastward is one of the most haunting parts of the story. Iranica's survey of Manichaeism in China says the religion had reached China by the 6th century, while related scholarship on Chinese Turkestan shows it was already well established in Tarakistan and the Tarim Basin before the 8th century, likely aided in part by Sogdian merchant networks. Later discoveries from places like Dunhuang and Kwoko confirmed that Mani's church had not merely brushed against the eastern end of Eurasia, but had taken root there in textual, artistic, and communal form. And once in China, Manichaeism did what universal religions have to do. It learned new languages without surrendering itself completely to them. Iranica notes that its Chinese history and literary production became visible through the discovery of genuine Chinese Manichean texts, while Cambridge scholarship emphasizes how the Eastern manuscript transforms modern understanding of East-West religious exchange. Even later, when the religion receded from prominence, Iranica's general survey says it found a last refuge in Fujian and that at Quanzhou with a Manichean temple and with a statue of Mani that survived under Buddhist disguise, testifying to the remarkably long afterlife of the religion of light in southern China. The prophet died in confinement, but the religion crossed deserts, courts, villages, and oceans of language. That is the eerie grandeur of Mani's afterlife. The man was chained, but the system moved on without him, and the farther it spread, the more one truth became unavoidable. Mani had not founded a sect meant to remain near its birthplace. He had founded a religion that expected the world. If Mani's religion spread across continents, one of the places it left its deepest mark was not in the Manichean kingdom, but in the mind of one of Christianity's greatest theologians. Augustine of Hippo spent about 9 years as a Manichean hearer, never advancing to the rank of the elect, but drawn deeply enough into the movement that its language, arguments, and cosmology helped shape the intellectual crisis of his youth. Modern scholarship treats that period as central to Augustine's development, not as a trivial detour. The Stanford Encyclopaedia of Philosophy notes that Augustine became a Manichean hearer in 373 and remained attached to the movement for 9 years, while Cambridge's Augustine in Context emphasizes that Manichaeism offered Augustine a strong sense of intellectual and cultural distinction in late antiquity. That matters because Augustine became one of the main ways the Latin West remembered Mani, and he did not remember him kindly. After leaving Manichaeism and converting to Christianity, Augustine wrote repeatedly against his former religion, attacking its doctrines, its claims about evil, and its use of Christian language. His later authority as bishop, theologian, and saint meant that any anti-Manichean argument became woven into the very fabric of Western Christian thought. His later authority as bishop, theologian, and saint meant that anti-Manichean argument became woven into the very fabric of Western Christian thought. In that sense, Mani's defeat in the Latin world was paradoxal. The religion lost power, but its ghost remained powerful enough that Augustine spent enormous energy refuting it. And this is where the story turns especially dark. For many centuries, the West knew Mani less through Manichean books than through the testimony of men like Augustine. The result was a memory filtered through controversy. Mani became a warning word. Manichean became shorthand for dangerous dualism, for cosmic extremism, for a worldview Christianity needed to defeat. Yet modern scholarship keeps pointing out that Augustine's hostility itself is evidence of how intellectually serious the movement was. He was not swatting away a trivial cult. He was wrestling with a religion that had once persuaded him it could explain evil, suffering, and the fractured structure of the world more convincingly than the Christianity he had first known. Mani loses the contest for orthodoxy in the Latin West, but he does not disappear. He survives as a pressure inside Augustine's thought, as a problem to be answered, a memory to be repudiated, a former allegiance that helped shape later Christian theology by opposition. The prophet history tried to bury was buried, in part, by one of Christianity's greatest minds, and yet even in burial he kept speaking. Because Augustine's war against him preserved the outline of the rival he could never fully ignore. So what remains of Mani now? A dead heretic, a failed prophet, a rival theology crushed by priests, bishops, and empires? That is how the story was told for a very long time. And yet, the deeper you look, the harder that version becomes to sustain. Mani was not merely the loser of a doctrinal war. He was one of late antiquity's most ambitious religious founders. A man who claimed revelation from a heavenly twin, wrote scripture to prevent corruption, painted doctrine so it could be seen as well as heard, built a church of elect and hearers, ordered ritual time through fasting and confession, and launched a religion that would move from Mesopotamia across Central Asia and into China. That is not the profile of a historical footnote. That is the profile of a founder who thought on the scale of civilizations. And maybe that is why history works so hard to bury him, but too dangerous to remember honestly. He stood at the crossing point of religions and refused to remain inside any of them. He spoke in the language of Jesus, but would not submit to Christian limits. He honored earlier messengers, but placed himself at the end of their line. He approached kings, but preached a truth larger than empire. He taught that the world itself was a wound, a catastrophic mingling of light and darkness, and that human life was caught inside that wound as both prisoner and participant. To accept Mani was not merely to join a sect, it was to inhabit a total rival vision of reality. What makes his story unforgettable is that he lost in history and endured anyway. He died in chains under Bahram, and his followers remembered that death as a martyrdom, even as crucifixion. His throne was left empty at the Bema, but the emptiness became ritual presence. His books were scattered, his communities persecuted, his name twisted into accusation. And still, the manuscripts kept surfacing. In Egypt, in Central Asia, in China, in fragments, hymns, codices, and painted worlds. The light he said was trapped in matter kept reappearing in the material record itself. So maybe the truest ending is this. Mani was buried, but not contained. His enemies preserved his outline because they could not ignore him. His followers preserved his memory because they believed prison had not silenced him, only raised him into another form of authority. In modern scholarship, piece by piece has begun pulling him back out of distortion, not as a cartoon of dualism, but as a prophet, painter, organizer, martyr, and architect of one of the most extraordinary world religions of late antiquity. I hope you all enjoyed, and until the next one, everybody be well. Later.